Welcome to our WP Educates podcast. This is Danielle Reynolds, and I lead our business development efforts here at Whitley Penn, along with hosting our Develop podcast. We had the opportunity to host a series of events highlighting the nonprofit industry and how different service lines work to add value. We have recorded those conversations to make them easily available to you. This episode focuses on risk advisory services with speaker and partner John Williamson. During this conversation, we discuss benefits in identifying solutions in order to mitigate and reduce exposure to risk for your organization and best practices for defining your controls and setting a control framework. Reach out and let us know how we can connect and help you today. Enjoy.
Perfect. Thank you. John, I'm going to let you start off by introducing yourself, and then we'll kick it over to Daniel for him to introduce himself.
Okay, thanks, Emily. So really a pleasure to be here this morning. Thanks everyone for attending. My name is John Williamson. I am the partner in charge of risk advisory services at our firm based out of our Dallas office. I'll tell you a little bit about me. I've come from a pretty unusual background for the accounting profession. Prior to my life in public accounting, I was actually a classical musician. So I grew up in Richardson, just north of Dallas, and fancied myself, a really good trumpet player. Went the whole all-state route, and then I got not only 1 but 2 degrees in music performance, which was probably not the wisest decision that I've ever made. But then I tried to then make a career out of it. So I did get to work on a contract basis with the Dallas Symphony and the Houston Symphony, but was never able to land that full-time job. So as a result, I also taught on the side. So I worked with several school districts within the DFW area. As my wife and I then began family planning, we figured it would probably be a good idea to get something with a little more steady income. So my father was a CPA. So I went back to school for a 3rd time and got a master's in accounting. And it was right out of that program that I landed at Whitley Penn. And so that was 12 years ago. I've been with Whitley Penn ever since. Definitely a Whitley Penn lifer. Really proud of the growth that we've had as a firm, and then also with our group. And it also happened to be a pretty wise decision because my wife and I ended up having 5 kids. You can only see just 3 of them behind me on screen, but it's definitely helped out from a family perspective. But our group, we primarily focus on internal controls, consulting, process, technology. We'll get into that later. Dan, who I'll hand off next for his introduction, has been an integral part in our group. So we've really grown the business quite a bit, and he's been a really valuable contributor to that. Dan, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thank you, John. So I'm not a Texas native. I moved out here about 7 years ago. And initially I thought, I want to work for one of the big 4 firms. I'd graduated with my accounting degree, and I just thought that is what I want to do. And I remember I talked to friends, and they said, all right, pick a focus. And they send me this long list of various things that they perform in their firm, and they'd say, you need to pick a focus. And I could never just pick out that one thing that I wanted to do. And so I met a partner at Whitley Penn and started about 7 years ago. And one thing I really like about the firm is, you get a lot of exposure to different industries, to different types of engagements, and it's really just been a very fulfilling experience. I don't have, the assortment of children that John has. I have 1 2-year-old. But working with this firm, has provided me the flexibility to, kind of work the hours I need to work. Sometimes, you'll find that various individuals might work really late during the day, but it's because they want to spend time with their children earlier on. And you can put together a schedule that works for you. And it's, like I said, just been a really fulfilling experience. I work a lot with financial institutions, and when I'm not working on those types of engagements, I'm oftentimes working on internal control engagements where we're helping, it could be new companies, non-for-profits, that have had difficulty developing their internal control environment, or they may have experienced some fraud, and they've asked us to come in and take a look at their environment to try to figure out, how to correct things. But like I said, it's just been a great experience watching the firm grow. When I initially started, I believe there were approximately 200 employees. From 2016 to now, the growth has just been tremendous. So like I said, it's just been a really, really fun ride as the firm continues to grow.
Man, those are the best introductions we've had so far. I did not know that John was a musician, so that surprise on my face was real. That's such a nice background to have on you. Okay, so y'all have touched on it a little bit, and I will tell everyone who's listening in, I think that what Risk Advisory Services does is one of the most valuable services we offer our nonprofit clients at Whitley Penn. So I'd just like y'all to walk us through what do you do? What is a typical sort of probably month in the life because of the different engagements you might touch in a month for you?
Yeah, good question. And you'll have to forgive me if I end up being long-winded on this one because it is a lot of different kinds of things. But usually when I'm asked what risk advisory services is, my response is, if it has anything to do with process, internal controls, compliance, or technology, then that's where our group fits in. Or maybe even put another way is that if you've got kind of a certain strategic direction that you're heading as an organization, you want to manage and mitigate risks through internal controls, policies, procedure, and technology, and that's where we fit in. So our service lines, there are numerous ones. I'll try to go high level and not too far into the weeds just on a question one. But first, internal audit. So the concept for internal audit is it's a function that sits within an organization, within a corporate structure that looks at operational policies and procedures, provides assurance and consulting services to ensure that internal controls are operating the way that the company or the organization thinks they should. So very often that group would then report to those charged with governance, say a board of trustees or an audit committee or finance committee, on the results of their procedures. And there's just kind of a checkup to make sure that the organization is following their own policies and procedures. In addition to that, we do SOX 404 work, so certainly not applicable to nonprofits, but for all publicly traded companies, the SEC and the PCAOB requires that management go through a process to assess their own internal control over financial reporting. We provide turnkey solutions for our clients where we can help them through that assessment and then report to their investors and the general public the quality of their internal control program. Something that Dan and I do quite a bit, this has been a really big growth, emerging part of our practice, is SOC reporting. And the concept for SOC reporting is simple, is that a lot of vendors have responsibilities and commitments to their customers. And they want to be able to demonstrate that they have sound internal controls, that they're protecting customer data within their systems. And so we go in and audit them, produce a report. That report gets distributed to all their customers, and it helps them in their business relationships and also helps them grow their own individual business. So just due to the fact that cybersecurity has been such an emerging risk for our clients, it's been a really valuable tool for service organizations and vendors to be able to demonstrate that they've got sound information security practices. In addition to that, we do internal controls consulting, and I'll probably ask Dan to elaborate on this, but we'll help our clients with policy and procedure development. Very frequently there may be kind of this tribal knowledge of practices and internal controls in place at organizations, but our clients will ask us, well, let's help get that on paper and get it better defined, and then provide recommendations to improve their internal control structure and best practices. Dan, do you have anything that you want to add on kind of that service line?
No, I think you've done a pretty thorough job of covering all the various things that we work on our day-to-day.
Yeah, I'd say on the internal controls consulting side, one of the benefits also too we found is succession planning, because you may have really key members within an accounting or finance function. They've been there for years. And I think kind of as organizations grow, or maybe their retirements within sight, that there's usually some kind of aha moment that, well, we need to kind of get all that institutional knowledge down on paper and kind of spread that knowledge around to the rest of the organization. So that's usually been pretty helpful. And I'll throw in just a couple of extra niche things, Emily, and then I'll stop talking, I promise. So we do information security consulting. We do have a pretty strong cybersecurity group. So to respond to the risk of data breaches and hacking, we've got a stand-up service where we'll do consulting around that. We can also do vulnerability scanning, pen testing to kind of stress test your information security controls in your network. And then last but not least, fraud prevention and forensic examinations. Internal controls are a great tool to prevent fraud. And so we can help organizations stand up those programs, but also if something does go wrong, we've got the capabilities to do some forensic analysis and examinations to try to figure out what's the extent of the damage and kind of what exactly happened.
What a great summary. And if you're tuning in, I'm sure you found something that piques your interest and helps your organization. But I'll let y'all kind of more specifically address, how would you work with nonprofit organizations?
Yeah,
We've worked together in the past, so you can feel free to lean in on that example too.
yeah, and I think we will. Because I threw out a lot of things that we do. I think the services or the work that we do that benefits nonprofits the most really focus on policy and procedure development, internal controls consulting, right? Trying to get your arms around best practices that would improve your processes, the reliability of your financial information, safeguarding assets, fraud prevention. I almost hate saying this because we want to trust our own people, we want to trust our employees, and I think in particular in the nonprofit space, I mean, you've got generally good people that are committed to good causes that you really want to trust. But the thing with fraud prevention, internal controls, it almost has to take an agnostic view to the person that's doing the work. Because ultimately the goal is to protect the organization from any wrongdoing, whether it's intentional or unintentional. And then last and finally, I mean, we've done some IT consulting and security consulting as well, where just with data breaches becoming such a huge risk, and I know we all get probably phishing emails at least once a day. We've got cyber criminals trying to target our accounting function to try to send money overseas and fall for all kinds of vendor payment scams. And what we do is we help train our clients and then also help them put best practices in place to protect them from those kinds of attacks.
That's great. So we've specifically worked on some internal control documentation processes before, as so many of our tax exempt organizations are starting to try and get grants that require a financial statement audit. The number one piece of advice I give them is, let's make sure those internal controls are all set before we even think about engaging an audit firm. Can you just walk us through the steps of internal controls and what's the benefit for those organizations that are thinking about implementing something either in preparation for an audit or just to do their own good due diligence?
Yeah, great question. So I'll probably start with some just broad concepts of internal controls and how they're beneficial. And I'll ask Dan to walk through some examples of how we've worked together and then benefited our nonprofit clients. So I know most of us, we're all usually kind of in the accounting finance function, so we're familiar with the concept of internal controls. But just to level set, it's a process that accomplishes an organization's objectives for operating effectiveness and efficiency of operations. And then there are usually three objectives. Those three objectives are operational goals, financial reporting goals, and compliance. Now, Emily, to your question on audit preparation, I mean, really the goal is going to be a focus on internal controls over financial reporting. The way that we approach that is we'll go through various transaction cycles, and for any business or any nonprofit, I mean, there's going to be certain transaction cycles are going to be key to ensuring that assets are safeguarded and that the recording of entries and financial reporting is accurate and complete. It'll be things like cash disbursements, cash receipts, payroll, grants is another one, on ensuring that you're accounting for the grant money and that it's being spent where it should be appropriately. Fixed assets, and so walk through different transaction cycles and then ask the question, what are the controls that help us ensure that transactions are authorized, they're being recorded correctly, that segregation of duties are in place so that there's no fraud risk, so that we have some kind of confidence in the reliability of our financial statement preparation. And so that's that kind of component for financial reporting. But usually whenever we look at the kinds of internal controls that benefit an organization, we'll focus on segregation of duties. And it's a really big one, and it's a really hard one, particularly for nonprofits and smaller nonprofits to accomplish.
Yeah.
And segregation of duties, just overall commentary, it's segregation between three separate functions or buckets. The first one is authorization, the second is custody of assets, and the third is recording or reconciling. And so when we work with our clients, we often challenge, hey, in your accounting processes, are you segregating those three functions out so that one person isn't doing all three? Because when one person does all three, that's usually problematic, where either errors can happen or there's also that increased fraud risk because you never know. And then on top of that, I think maybe 20 years ago, we looked really just at processes and functional responsibilities, but more and more, we're looking at IT systems and who has access to do what within those systems to ensure that assets are appropriately safeguarded. In addition to that, I mean, there are certain automated solutions that help ensure that transactions are authorized. And we more and more rely on applications and information systems to ensure that we're helping get those authorization protocols in place. And then really it's just, it's safeguarding of assets, and then, analytics and reviews over time. So those are just kind of some common internal control concepts that we try to help encourage our clients get their arms around. Dan, could you walk through, I think there's one particular example that Emily has in mind where I think we teamed up for one nonprofit. Maybe you can kind of walk through what their ask was, and how we were able to help them.
Yeah, and I was going to add, as I look at that second question there, I think there's a lot of benefit to not only having strong internal controls, but having, thorough, policies and procedures that, really guide the action of employees. Oftentimes, we get pulled in and we're asked to help them develop policies because they're saying, hey, we're not quite sure what we should be doing,
Right.
what really should be our practices. And like John said, there may be somebody that's getting ready to retire, as we saw through the Great Resignation. There's a lot of key individuals that are moving on, and you want to capture some of that knowledge. And that's usually where we get pulled in and they say, hey, help us document, these policies. What happens if we have travel expenses? What happens if, we issue a company credit card? What should be our policy? What documentation should be completed? And that's really what sets, kind of the tone of the organization of how transactions should be processed. And like John alluded to, oftentimes, resources are limited. And so that's really kind of the document that says, here's what we really need to do in these situations. But in that particular instance, the client came to us and said, hey, we do have a company credit card. How do we address those expenses? What expenses, are reasonable? And, I think that's really helpful, especially if you experience fraud. And our job is to go in and identify unauthorized transactions. If we don't have a policy, then we're really kind of just relying on management to say, well, I don't think that trip to 7-Eleven or, that Amazon purchase was authorized. But if you have a policy in place, that really dictates exactly what the employee should be using those company assets, that company credit card for. If you're traveling, what type of travel expenses, should you, can you expense? What is considered a personal expense? As you're looking at segregation of duties, what does that process look like if you're reconciling, say, the bank statements? Having all of that outlined within a policy, I think, really helps guide the organization, especially in those times where maybe you're a person short, or somebody's on the verge of retirement. At least you have kind of that basic framework outlined into a document. So I think that's really important to have, especially as we're looking at internal controls. Oftentimes, that policy document is something that we use to help determine whether or not you're in compliance with the company guidelines. So I think the two really go hand to hand, and it's sometimes hard to have internal controls, really good internal controls, if you have no policies to back those up.
And if I may, Dan, also just one additional point to highlight, for this particular nonprofit we work with, they were subject to an annual audit, and their audit firm had some recommendations, some findings as a part of their audit, and that really pointed to the lack of defined policies and procedures that define their internal control processes. So, I think part of the objective was to help address the audit recommendations, but there really was a dual purpose, because I think they recognized the need and the criticality for having policy documents put in place. And I mean, from our perspective, I think it also helps with governance and oversight, because trustees want to know that the organization's performing on their fiduciary responsibilities. Well, what's one way to do that? Well, let's get the policy statements in line and then ensure there are accountability mechanisms to make sure the whole organization is following those policies.
Y'all kind of danced all around this, but I think nothing shows a weakness like having to write out what the actual steps really truly are on a day-to-day basis. And that's what really helped that organization. And I think an unexpected benefit is, I think everyone in the room today as an accountant, a lot of times we get put in the position of being the bad cop, enforcing things and making judgments for the whole organization. And having a policy sort of takes a little bit off of us and makes it easier to point back to that documentation and say, gosh, this just really doesn't feel in line. Amazon purchases, when you said that, Dan, I cannot tell you how much I see Amazon transactions come through, and it could be almost anything, and it's really hard to tell what's going on. So it's been really, really helpful for us to walk through together. You guys have really shared a lot about the value you provide organizations, but is there anything you haven't already touched on that you would like to kind of explicitly say a little bit more on?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. I think, Emily, we probably addressed a lot of those, so I want to be real cognizant of being overly redundant. Maybe I'll make a couple of comments, one of which is, so I think you made a very salient point on the accountants don't always need to be the bad guys. I have found that, and I just want to be cautious using the word, politically, but politically within the organization, it can be a little tenuous sometimes when you've got those in operations outside of the accounting function spending money, and the accountants are the ones, saying, hey guys, we really need to rein this in. We need to make sure that we're following best practices. What are those? Well, if you've got a definitive set of guidelines, and it really helps manage those relationships within the organization. But, I touched on this previously. I mean, just the overall governance process, if you've got sound internal controls in place and policies in place, I think it just helps the board, with oversight of the organization, but it also helps with senior management and board relationships too, because there's a clear roadmap on what the organization has decided, they would follow. So I think it just helps with that interpersonal relationships and dynamics throughout the organization. I know we've talked about fraud risk, but I mean, one of the primary benefits of sound internal controls is it really helps with fraud risk. And then, in addition to that, I touched on this previously as well, but more like an industry trend over the past few years with internal audit and then just internal control work in general is focusing not just on the protection of assets, but asking the questions of, where are we strategically wanting to head? What are our strategic objectives? Can we then enact processes and controls to help us get there and manage the risks along the way? And so it's not just kind of all right, well, let's just make sure nobody's stealing money, or let's just not make sure just the financials are accurate, but also, can we do this in a way that's really going to help advance the mission of the organization?
You touched on fraud. We talked about it in one of our previous episodes and with our audit team. Walk us through kind of how you help prevent fraud. You've done a lot of this already, so feel free to kind of edit where you would like here.
Yes, so I'll talk through a couple of things, and then we'll have story time, and I'll ask Dan to tell some stories of kind of what we've done with some other clients. So a lot of our work is on fraud prevention, and that is through ensuring that sound internal controls are set up to prevent fraud. We've touched on a lot of it, but I mean, sound segregation of duties, and it's not just functional, but it's looking at system access within the general ledger software, within banking software, and ensuring that the right controls, dual authorization, locking down access to certain functions within EFTs or ACH templates within the banking software. locking down controls on the vendor master file. I mean, we will take a very information systems bent and doing that segregation of duties analysis to help prevent fraud. So a lot of our work, since it's controls based, is fraud prevention, which I like because I'd much rather prevent fraud than detect it.
Sure.
Right. So that's where a lot of our work is focused. However, many times our clients, if they didn't have those sound preventative controls in the front end, they may be suspicious that an employee might be stealing from them or something might be going wrong. And so at that point, then they would engage us to come do more of a forensic examination or an analysis of those transactions and what may have occurred. And I think Dan and I, in putting our heads together for this morning, came up with a couple of examples of how we've done that in the past. Dan, would you mind walking through this?
Sure. Well, I've worked on, I can't think of how many fraud engagements over the last few years, but, they all have a few common elements. First off, it's always a trusted individual that's perpetrated the fraud, and usually it's an individual realize that nobody's looking over their shoulder. I know that anytime we have new staff come on board, they'll always ask, have you ever caught fraud? And yes, I have, but oftentimes if we're engaged to perform that internal audit function, we don't. And oftentimes just knowing that somebody's looking over their shoulder is in itself just a good preventative measure. People know that we're going to go in and take a look at, various transactions that are completed by various individuals. And oftentimes that's enough to prevent them from perpetrating fraud or completing unauthorized transactions. But in the instances where, we've had clients reach out to us, it's oftentimes a really simple fraud scheme. We oftentimes, listen to the movies and think it's always super complicated, but oftentimes it's really simple. And it's usually a case where somebody has a company issued credit card. They're responsible for reconciling the bank statements. They have the ability to enter, journal entries, and nobody's looking over their shoulder. Is it us that's catching the fraud? And oftentimes it could be the financial institution calling and saying, hey, we've noticed some unauthorized, some not necessarily unauthorized, but unusual transactions. Are these authorized? And they're suspecting that somebody has maybe stolen their credit card. I think I ran into an instance where an employee had tried to process their car payment, and the bank called him and said, hey, is this you? And of course, the client then started looking at all the transactions that had occurred on this bank statement and realized they had a problem. Another instance, I think it was the client that may have come forward and said, hey, we've noticed just some unusual transactions here. Can you take a look? And lo and behold, there's $1 million in fraud there over the course of just a short period, a year and a half. So things like that happen, and the controls that you would need to put in place to mitigate those fraud risks are oftentimes really simple. And like John said, if you struggle with segregation of duties, then it's you've got to kind of think outside of the box and say, well, how do we make sure that there is somebody looking over their shoulder just to say, hey, are you doing anything that you shouldn't? But having those good policy documents in place really help us as we're reviewing those transactions. Say, hey, what do we think is authorized and what do we think is unauthorized? Because that policy document can really help define that. Oftentimes, we're relying on management to kind of give us that guidance. But the policy really, really helps. And oftentimes it can help deter that bad behavior if the employee knows, hey, this is really what's outlined. But if they know there's no policy in place, there's nobody looking over their shoulders, they have the opportunity, they've got the means to perpetrate the fraud, then they'll oftentimes take advantage. One of the controls that oftentimes helps find this or identify this is just the mandatory 5-day vacation, and making sure that somebody else can go in and perform those job duties for a short period of time. And then you often realize that, hey, there's maybe some vendor fraud here, or maybe there's some HR issues, maybe there's a ghost employee that's built in. And as you start looking through those records, you realize that there's something not quite right. And that's, like I said, when we normally get pulled in to perform procedures. And it's really tough in those situations to give an estimate of how long it's going to take to get through all the records, because you can never go back to the individual and say, hey, Joe, what did you do? We're always kind of left with, this is what we think the individual has done, but we can never go back and interview the individual and say, hey, is this it? Or did you have access to these other things? Because usually once you determine that fraud's been, committed, you go through and delete the user. And so then we've got to kind of backtrack and figure out, what other areas do we think this individual may have compromised, some of these financial statements or records, or maybe there's some journal entries that are out of place. So it's oftentimes a challenge to go through and figure out what the total number is if we're reporting on the unauthorized amounts.
And I will say, fortunately, the couple that Dan and I have worked on together in the past year or two, they were not nonprofit organizations. So, that I thought was very fortunate. It's kind of sad, but it's also kind of fascinating. One was a physical security company based out of the West Coast. And that was the $1 million fraud scheme that Dan was talking about. And you look through the credit card records, and there's over $100,000 in Best Buy gift cards that they purchased with the company credit card. And you're just thinking, my goodness, like, how did you not expect to get caught at some point? But then also, Emily, I mean, you mentioned the Amazon purchases. I mean, we all, I think my wife may be the biggest Amazon customer out there in the world. And when you look at that credit card statement, all it says is Amazon on it. And you have no idea what they bought unless you have access to the actual Amazon account. So it can be pretty challenging. So, I mean, setting some real clear boundaries and guidelines, I think, is really critical.
I saw that somebody, and this was on a recent engagement, they used the company issued credit card to pay for their annual Prime membership. And that one was really just obvious that is not an authorized transaction. But sometimes you'll see that people get really comfortable.
Yeah, it's working in our CAS group. I would say the single most terrifying thing to many of our clients is the credit card misuse, whether something has gone wrong or they just feel like something could go wrong. And I would tell you, John, that my husband would argue that his wife might be the biggest Amazon customer. Well, kind of getting back on track, is there anything you see kind of changing in the industry over the next few years as it relates to what you do?
Yeah, I think Dan and I, we put our heads together on this, and I mean, I think there are certainly some things, right? Now, whether they're going to be absolutely transformational in the nonprofit industry, I mean, I could see this being more of a for-profit focus, some of these things that we're seeing, but I mean, some of the challenges is, technological enhancements. So, there's going to be continuous monitoring improvements out there. There's going to be software that's going to be made available that can monitor for any red flag transactions and report those out to those charged with governance, senior management. What are the challenges? And I think all of us, it seems like a hot topic, but just AI and how that's going to integrate into our business processes and our overall, kind of company environment. I had a call yesterday with a client asking about, they said, we are actually going to try to leverage chat GPT as a core part of our business. They're an application development company. ChatGPT is great at writing application code. But their biggest concern is having their employees enter intellectual property that belongs to that company in an open source AI platform. So we're having to try to tackle that risk of how do we prevent them from dropping stuff in ChatGPT that they shouldn't, that is intellectual property owned by the company. In addition to that, I mean, we're seeing such a rise on data breaches and ransomware attacks. I mean, and that's industry agnostic. I mean, ransomware bad actors will target any company of any size in any industry, and it's such an easy scheme. I mean, really all it takes is you pay for a kind of pre-developed ransomware. It's ransomware as a service. You buy the file, and then you attach it to a hyperlink, and you just shoot out emails hoping somebody's going to click on it. And as soon as that one person does, the ransomware is then downloaded on the device, and you've got an attack vector to then take advantage of the company and steal funds. So that's certainly one that we're seeing. In our for-profit clients, particularly publicly traded, I mean, ESG has been something that we've been asked to look at over the past year or two, and just trying to forecast what are our corporate responsibilities and obligations going to be from an ESG perspective, and then putting those programs in place to track the data, report on it, ensure that we're actually meeting those objectives. Dan, anything else that you can think of?
One thing that I thought is pretty relevant, especially to smaller non-for-profits, is what are your policies and procedures if you decide you're going to allow people to bring their own device to work and utilize their own personal laptops? One of the biggest risks there is, how do you make sure that, antivirus, application has been installed or updated, the definitions are there, my password parameters meet the organization's requirements. There's oftentimes, there's no monitoring of those devices. And so that presents a big risk for the organization if, they don't have really good cyber hygiene. But that's something that we often see, is that people want to use their iPads. They want to be able to use their own personal laptop. And there is a risk there that their security requirements don't meet the organization's policy guidelines. So that's something, I think you definitely need to be aware of, is people request to bring their own devices to work. It's, how do we manage that?
Really, really good tips in there. You've talked about it in this question and in previous questions, but since such a big part of what you do is IT consulting, and we increasingly pivot towards a world where we're only really connected through the internet, are there things that you're doing and that you're helping with that are, I think this could be really relevant for nonprofits, whether or not you've done it for nonprofits yet?
Yes. So I'll focus probably on the security side, is where we've seen the largest uptick in demand because it's such a significant risk. Now, I mean, we do provide other consulting services that aren't, geared towards security, but I'll focus on cybersecurity because I think that's probably the biggest need that we're seeing in the market right now. So there are a couple of things that we've been doing with our clients that we found to be very beneficial. One of which is we can run vulnerability scans on your network and any internet facing devices that essentially is scanning for any misconfigurations or any weaknesses in code, vulnerabilities that external attackers may be able to take advantage of. We're then able to then provide that to your IT service provider, whether it's in-house or using a contracted firm, to then go patch those vulnerabilities to kind of shore up the network to make sure that those vulnerabilities are no longer present. We've also got the capability to do some penetration testing, which means it's almost like white hat attacking, meaning we pretend to be a hacker and we see what we can take advantage of, whether we can actually gain access to your network, to company assets, and then report back to you and then give you recommendations to then plug those gaps. But most importantly, we do risk assessments where we walk through current infrastructure, controls, and processes to make sure that you've got the right procedures in place to protect yourself from criminal attacks. I will say for us, I mean, some of the big points that I would emphasize, multi-factor authentication is huge. I know it's a beatdown sometimes that, we get prompted to enter our password at least a couple times a day, and then we got to then, enter the code from our phone. But having two different points where you have to authenticate really does protect you from external actors. So ensuring that multi-factor is enabled for all of your systems is a good way to protect yourself. Having an incident response plan. So a lot of people are seeing that, it's not if, but when you're most likely going to be subject to an attack at some point. So putting a plan in place on how you're going to respond. If we do have a ransomware attack, what are we going to do about it? A lot of people just kind of freeze and they think, okay, should we pay the criminals? Should we not? Should we try to recover to a backup? Do we even have a good backup that we can restore to? And then these questions start to bubble up. So having a roadmap in place that if it does happen, you've already got a plan document that you can follow is really helpful. And a couple of other things, we find that there are certain administrative accounts that has access to a lot of systems and a lot of data, usually a nonprofit organization, smaller ones. You may have more people that have administrative access than you would probably desire. Some of this may also be shared accounts where multiple people know the password to the account. Really focusing on protecting those accounts is really critical because when the bad guys come after you, those are the accounts they're going to be aiming for. And once they gain access to those administrative accounts, that's when it gets really bad because then they have access to everything. So trying to lock down controls over use of those passwords, restricting those accounts is usually pretty important. And then last but not least, just security awareness training. I mean, I know we're all probably doing it, or most of us are, where we do the annual security training that's web-based. That's really, it's low-hanging fruit. It's usually pretty inexpensive to launch one of those programs, but making sure that people are educated in your organization about security risks really helps create awareness and ward off any potential bad acts conducted by bad actors.
Yeah, that's great. I can't thank both of you enough for coming and talking through so many valuable different ways that you can help not just nonprofits, but all organizations kind of operating in the current current climate. Is there anything I haven't asked that you want to share about?
Yeah, so Emily, that question is geared towards us. If there's anything that we'd like to share that we haven't yet, not really. I mean, the only thing I would say is that our contact information should be made available to you. And we're also on the website. And so, like, we love working with our clients. And if you have questions, we'll make the time to schedule a phone call and talk through those with you, just to try to provide you with recommendations, try to help improve your environment. So, if you do have any questions or anything you want to talk through, just anything one-off that comes into your head, please feel free to reach out to me or Dan. We'd be happy to connect with you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Danielle. I'm going to kick it back over to you to wrap us up.
Yeah, wow, that was like a wealth of knowledge. You guys have the best stories. I feel like we could have just listened to your stories all day long. I love how you said, John, that the value your group brings is ultimately to allow the organization to focus on its mission. I think that's really, really important, especially as it relates to our nonprofit clients. So I love that. So just wanted to reiterate that. And those are some really great tips too. I was like, wow, some probably are easier to implement than others too. I know a lot of companies that implement the mandatory 5 consecutive business day PTO. And I know it's not just good and necessary for your own mental break, but a good tip that they implement or a good process and control in place. So, wow, I learned equally as much as probably everyone on this call. That was so fun. So we hope you guys have a great day. Thank you again for joining us. We'll see you guys soon.